Internally, we developed a EVM workbook with projections, it's forecasting. It's just basically like a project workbook, project health across the board. Bring in his export for the scheduling side, and then we tie it back to our accounting software, get all the actual data, the budgets, the phases, the cost codes, bring all of that into that workbook just by utilizing a query, and then link that data.
Oftentimes in construction, we have some schedules out there, 22, 30,000 activities. How do you keep up with something that is that large? Something that Assemble has allowed us to do is call out entire areas. And then since we're doing that quantity tracking, we can get a lot more of an accurate percent complete while having a lot smaller quantity of activities. If we had some sort of AI or machine that could just drive around the site and see what percent complete we were done in certain areas, and then that could auto feedback into our reporting, I think that's the space for the most growth.
Hi, folks. A quick one before we dive into this week's episode. Our book, The Critical Path Career, How to Advance in Construction and Planning and Scheduling, is out now, and you can order it on Amazon. We'll include a link below. This is a great way to show support for the Beyond Deadlines podcast, and Greg and I have worked extremely hard taking everything we know in our 30 years of experience, plus everything we've picked up from shooting this podcast, and we've tried to pack it into an information-dense book that you can use right away. In the book, we have specific strategies on how to get a raise, how to get a promotion, and find a new job. We include 26 of the best interview questions that we have come across, in addition to 34 specific impact ideas that you can go use on your projects today. We want to thank everyone who's shown us support so far and enjoy this week's episode. Welcome to the Beyond Deadlines podcast, where we tackle challenges that planning and schedule leaders come across on a day-to-day basis. My name is Micah. I'm the CEO of Movar US, a project management consultancy.
I'm Chris Micah, project controls manager at Lighthouse Electric.
Brian Casertano, scheduling manager at Lighthouse Electric.
Today, we have a good one for you folks. We're going to jump into the fan favorite Earn Value Management EVM. Chris, Frank, you've been paired up with a large GC who wants to implement EVM across the program. How do you do it?
Good question. Frank, you want to start? Yeah.
I think right out of the gate, and where my mind initially goes is a strong foundation to EVM starts with a schedule. You need to have a very thorough schedule, and that usually starts with making sure there's a lot of collaboration between us and our GC. Oftentimes that becomes sharing the XER files or maybe sharing an Excel file if XER is not the way. But having a really smooth, well thought out plan schedule that we can all move forward to. So that way, really, we have a strong baseline for all the initial calculations within EVM.
That makes a ton of sense. Is there like a certain level or like quality level? Like, is there certain things when you say a strong schedule? I guess, can you maybe highlight a little bit more? Like, what does that actually mean?
Yeah. So a few different things when we look for what we qualify as a strong schedule. First off, we're looking for what we usually call as a level 4 detail schedule. So it's not just your very high level bookends of overhead rough or set equipment. We're looking for all the individual phases of a job, everything from estimation to the BIM and prefabrication stage, all the way through project closeout with all levels and zones combined. From there, we really go into what we use. It's the DCMA 14-point system, and we really utilize that to analyze how good the schedule's coming across. I'm looking for common things like relationship ties, negative float, stuff in that nature. We're looking at multiple things within that, such as negative lags. One thing, there's absolutely no negative lags within our schedules. A few other things, you're looking at relationship styles, you're looking at total quantity of activities, how much of that is tied in with relationships. You shouldn't have any open ends other than your start project and end project. No constraints, no hard constraints, mandatory constraints, stuff like that is really what we're looking to keep out of the schedules. And when we run our reports within P6, it allows us to really get a deep dive report on all of those values.
Wow, that's perfect. And right before this, Chris, I think you were going to jump in and I cut you off. But let's just say you go in and you have some pretty darn good scheduling practices. And so now you're ready to kind of take that jump into EVM. Can you talk a little bit, though, about, before we get into the tactics of that, like how do you tee this up from an organization side? Because I feel like a lot of people, you say EVM, and they go running for the hills. So how do you kind of like soften, the crowd up so you can implement this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the biggest thing is just kind of identifying, showing the whole organization the level of detail that you can get and just the quality of information that can be provided from a process like this. I think originally with our journey with EVM, it was something that, similar to this prompt, was required for the job. So we all kind of figured it out together. But then through that, we created and found the value by just seeing, by utilizing the EVM process, the result that project at completion, seeing the result of all that labor and fine tuning the process and figuring out. A big thing that I was going to add in of kind of that setup is establishing what specific or what level of detail you want to get the whole process to, and kind of getting the whole team on board with that, right? The whole internal team, external team, the GC, the owner, kind of everybody understanding, okay, we're going to go to this level of detail with this because that's the level that all of our other processes can support, and make sure that we're, not bogging down accounting or the project team. So I think getting the whole team sold on the value of the process and what it can provide in regards to backup and just understanding where you're at, where you're headed, far earlier than the alternative of just kind of seeing where things end up and being a little bit more reactive. I think just selling the team on the proactive nature of earned value management definitely helps kind of get total buy-in from everybody.
You mentioned levels there. Can you talk to me about where you would see it being beneficial and then maybe where you're seeing it, the juice isn't worth the squeeze per se?
Yeah, I think it can be project to project on how specific you get with certain things, right? And I think it's based around the type of construction and what the team is installing. So maybe for a data center, you just want to know or want to get to a level of detail that is the phase or the data hall within the building. Maybe on a hospital, it's down to individual rooms and you need to coordinate and sign off certain areas that are more specific than just a zone. You need to know a specific room or a set of rooms. So I think that all kind of pairs into what we do on earned value management. So how are we building it is a big question. And then also even just down to specifics of what we're trying to accomplish. Maybe the project is highly prefabbed and there's a lot of details that we're trying to collect in regards to information like skidding, or maybe we're doing a lot of individual overhead kits or something like that. And we know that we can support back to our cost codes, right? Our accounting information, a level of detail that's to the specific kit. Then maybe we can get that kit information plugged into the schedule and track our percent complete to that level as well. So it's, I think, identifying those three ingredients of earned value management: earned value, planned value, actual costs, and then identifying the sources of those information and just making sure that for the specific project, we can support a level of detail that can spread across all three of those.
Yeah, that was perfect. And you kind of started leading into my next question where I really want to get it kind of into the tactical weeds of setup of this. They have a nice P6 schedule. It's looking pretty good. Walk me through tactically, how do you then actually get EVM set up? Like, where's the data coming from? How does the process work? Like, let's get super granular in the weeds here.
Yeah, I think we can take it first from P6 and then from my hand point off to Chris. But essentially, the first thing we're doing is we'll take our schedule. P6 exports into Microsoft Excel rather easily. So what we do is we run through a very thorough check of our schedule using internal key performance indicators that we've established to ensure a standardization across codes, activity names, making sure that everything's rolling up correctly. And then from there, once we know we have a good, strong schedule internally, we're able to easily just export straight to Excel. And from there, it's rather simple from our part. We just send it right off to Chris, and Chris's team takes it from there.
What are you exporting out in terms of columns? You got the start date, the finish date. Do you already have quantities loaded in it? Do you have activity codes for, area group, blah, blah, blah? What does that export look like?
Yeah, so there's probably 20 to 30 different columns that we actually include in our exports, but it's everything from your activity IDs and your names, your basic things, start dates, durations, percent complete, stuff like that. But then we have a very thorough system of internal codes that we use, activity codes. So things like different scopes or different teams, who's working on what, whether you're doing temp power or overhead rough, if something's being stick built or if there was fabrication involved. And there's a lot of different codes that allow us to drill down into different details of portions of our schedule.
And so then the hot potatoes passed over to Chris. You're getting a nice Excel export. What do you do with this 30 column Excel export besides start crying? I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Initially. So I mean, again, Frank's team, the scheduling department, that was a big part of that initial figuring out our internal process, was figuring out how to kind of clean up and make a typical P6 export across all of our projects so that we weren't having to reinvent the wheel on every project. So we get that export from Frank. Internally, we developed a EVM workbook, which is a little bit more than that. It's projections, it's forecasting. It's just basically like a project workbook, project health across the board. Bring in his export for the scheduling side. And then that Excel workbook, we tie it back to our accounting software. So tie it to the actual accounting information, get all the actual data, the budgets, the phases, the cost codes, bring all of that into that workbook just by utilizing a query, and then link that data. And then kind of that last ingredient of EVM.
Before you move on to that last little spice ingredient you're going to talk about, what's your link between your accounting software and your scheduling? Do you do it by control accounts? Like, what is that coding structure that's your Rosetta Stone?
Yeah. So part of that coordination between scheduling and accounting, project controls, and Frank's team, it's been developing that link. Accounting, we're looking at the job, and then we're going to the phase level, and then we're going to the cost code level. We have a standard ABS structure across the board, and then into those cost codes, we get into some more level of detail. So on Frank's side of it, he can kind of explain a little bit of what we're getting out of P6, but there is truly a direct link, requires some level of a key between the activity and the phase and cost code, but it may be called something slightly different within P6, but we're able to basically link up both. We're able to link up the two sources of information through those two categories, phase and cost code.
Yeah, and that's I think the key to it is we mentioned the challenge of this 30 column Excel workbook, right? How do you navigate something like that? The key for us is really standardization. So we're making sure that it's a one-to-one exchange from our ERP system straight into P6. So everything's connected. There's no translation where you have to say, okay, well, this one's cost one, and then in P6 it breaks into 3 or 4 different cost codes. We make sure that everything is very structured. I think standardization as a whole, just when you're having so many different columns, so many different avenues for all this data, you always need a single source of truth really to combine across all your different projects so that everything's speaking all the same language.
Let me ask you the $1 million question then. So does this mean you're essentially cost loading at each activity in P6, or is there like a higher level up?
At this point in time, a lot of our schedule has been resource loaded. It hasn't been too much cost loading.
So, but are you are you resource loading at each activity?
Yes, we are.
Okay, all right. I like how you guys party. Okay, perfect. So let's jump into the workbook. That makes sense to me. It's structured, and then it goes into the workbook. Now, what are you then using that workbook for? You said you're creating some reports or whatever. Maybe just some of those highlights. Like, what does that really facilitate that's been helping the business out?
Yeah. So I think the last kind of ingredient to bring into the workbook is the earned value. And that aspect comes in a couple different ways. It can come through Assemble. It can come through different sort of internal platforms that we may have for understanding what a percent complete is, but they ultimately kind of comes in through that P6 export as well. So the P6 data is giving us our planned value, our earned value, and then we get our actual cost directly from the accounting software. So from there, kind of what is the value based off of those three pieces of information? It's pretty endless. I think primarily it's the kind of going back to earned value management. It's the metrics that we get. So cost performance index, how are we doing on our cost? How are we performing? Labor performance index, how are we performing for our labor? The schedule performance index. And then being able to look at those metrics at that specific level of detail across the job. So maybe if the job is underperforming in the schedule, right, we have a low SBI, then we can get into those specific cost codes and see all the information associated with that specific cost code that is driving the overall project down or phase, or just kind of like start zooming in and zooming out on our data and be able to make decisions at 10% of kind of based off of those metrics, where we're headed, where's our cost of completion headed based off of our efficiency metrics and whatnot, and make some of those decisions sooner in the project as opposed to after we've actually seen the impact.
Could you refrain and give an example of like what specifically one of those decisions might be? I mean, you're 10% in, you share it with the project manager, the superintendent, whoever you're working with. What is the conversation looking like, and what kind of adjustments are you seeing out in the field or on the project?
Yeah, I mean, it can be a couple different things. It could be something as simple as identifying where there's some confusion on a cost code where maybe actual cost is getting charged to the wrong category. And that could be just something as simple as, hey, I see that we earned a lot in the site code, but we're charging a lot of our time to the same activity in area 1. So maybe there's just some confusion between site versus area 1, and it's something that could get cleared up that quickly. But that's also just beneficial because we can stop some of those issues earlier as opposed to just letting a cost code kind of run over whatnot. Another specific is if something is truly identified as an issue or low in our efficiency metrics and something is wrong, then it's starting to kind of dive into more of the why. So if we identified that we're underperforming in our overhead category, then it's going to where we're tracking our percent complete. So we're utilizing a quantity tracking software called Assemble. So diving into that data and looking into the model and seeing, okay, what's in our way? What constraints are leading to this inefficiency? And then it's extremely beneficial to take that sort of information either to our internal team and identify things that we need to change on our level, or kind of take it to the project team as a whole and our general contractor and just kind of work together to clear up some roadblocks.
Ooh, I heard quantities in there. Frank, before you get in there, I heard some quantities in there. So is that in addition to resources, you also have quantity tracking, and are those all in that same kind of EVM package?
Yeah, same sort of structure. So again, we use that program called Assemble, which is basically our model broken out, and then we're able to apply status to the different aspects of the model. And it is broken out to that level of, overhead. It's still going back to the phase and cost code within the model kind of area. So if in the model we get to something that would be under the overhead cost code for phase 1 and we're marking it as installed, that all flows back through to, overhead phase 1 that's within the schedule, overhead phase 1 that's within our actuals. And again, that's kind of where all that information is coming together. So we can do kind of what I talked about in the last example, dive into those specifics of where are we actually seeing an issue all the way back to the point of install. If that kind of answers the question.
That's brilliant. Go ahead, Frank. Sorry.
Yeah, and I would also just jump in on Assemble too. Like Assemble is truly my favorite part about this whole process with EVM because from a scheduler's perspective, right, Assemble allows us to have a lot simpler of a schedule. Oftentimes in construction, we have some schedules out there 30,000 activities. How do you keep up with something that is that large, right? Something that Assemble has allowed us to do is we will, rather than having every single conduit called out within the schedule, or maybe conduit runs, right? We can call out entire areas. And then since we're doing that quantity tracking, we can get a lot more of an accurate percent complete while having a lot smaller quantity of activities, right? So it allows us to be more granular and be a lot more precise with how we're reporting back, but at the same time have a lot less activities and have a lot less upkeep on the overall reporting structure. And honestly, that's probably one of my favorite things to like really just dive into in the whole EVM side of things.
As an owner, whenever I'm reviewing schedules, I am way more lenient on duration. Like, hey, do you want to go longer than 20 days? Do you want to go less activities? If there's that quantity backup to match it, it just is like, every time I see it, I'm like, you know what? We don't need to go down to that level of detail. You can just roll that on up. Let's transition a little bit out of the actual kind of day-to-day tracking. Could you talk to a little bit about how you foresee using this like wealth of data you're collecting on future jobs to work out?
Yeah, I mean, I can start there, Chris. I think the one thing is we're recording all this historical data, right? So we're seeing how we're performing. You can, number one, we're keeping track of this in all the different industries. So whether it's a data center or a battery plant or whatever it might be, we can see how we perform in certain regards. And it correlates well with our last conversation of the quantity tracking as well, because the time spent you can compare one for one to like how much quantity is going in and how much conduit's being installed. But the big thing there is it just allows us to use historical data to estimate where we're going to go in the future, so our schedules in the future have more of that measured mile approach, right? We know how long things take. We know what an efficient install looks like, and we can use that in the future to really get stronger baselines and have a stronger foundation to our projects moving forward.
Yeah, I agree with everything Frank said. I think kind of one thing to drive home in that as well is that I think previously we would collect all this data project to project, but the way that data would look would be different. So we spent a lot of time internally, probably over the last year and a half, of making, that EVM workbook I was talking about is the same across all of our projects, whether it's a $300 million job. It's the same sort of data that's getting collected so that we can look at it and understand it the same way, as opposed to, again, previously where it was just maybe it was collected in different format or different areas or just a lot of differences to it. Made it difficult to bring it all back together and utilize it, on an estimate going forward or just various projects going forward and whatnot.
Now, no process is perfect. Where in your kind of chain are you looking to squeeze out any more improvements?
Primarily, I would say one of the biggest areas that we're trying to improve or just like find the next best way to do things would be the collection of our earned value. So our percent complete. So we're doing quantity tracking. Our current process is rather manual. It's the project team is required to go into that model and update the status, which works well, but say it's more of that smaller scale job that doesn't have a huge team, we're a little bit limited into the level of detail that we can get with that quantity tracking. You feel it less when it's a larger scale job because you can throw a bunch of people into that process and we can get to that same level of detail. I would say from my perspective, that's probably the biggest thing that we're currently exploring ways to help automate that or make that more accurate or just consistently, week after week, just a little bit more of a rhythm with that without having to, utilize this massive team all the time to get all of that information.
Yeah, I'd really echo the same thing. Rather than having people count quantities for how much in conduit's been installed or whatever it might be, if we had some sort of AI or machine that could just drive around the site and see what percent complete we were done in certain areas, and then that could auto feedback into our reporting. I think that's the space for the most growth. There are a lot of platforms out there, and it's exciting to see what's on on the forefront here. I think, yeah, there's definitely some room for improvement there.
Wow. Everyone who sells a robot dog is going to be knocking on your door. Or should I
We're
say
looking
yapping
for
at
it.
your door? I don't know which one. Chris, Frank, you guys have an amazing system set up. Thank you so much for taking the time to jump in and kind of walk us through the processes that you've put in place over the years, kind of building and growing this system. I know it just doesn't come overnight. Before we jump, any final thoughts you want to leave the crowd with?
I would just say that, thank you for having us on the call. It's been, again, it's a process that's been developed over many months and many years, and requires kind of creating that base layer of, again, getting cost codes set up that makes sense, getting a WBS set up that makes sense, and then working on getting streamlined clean P6 data and kind of developing all of that base foundation. And then, like you said, it takes a lot of individuals to refine the process and get feedback loops, but it is absolutely worth it. The whole value management process is definitely been beneficial to us, and I think it's a great process.
Yeah, just to all the listeners out there, I mean, P6 is a monster in itself, and I wouldn't get discouraged. EVM is just as tall of a task, but it all comes down to standardization, working as a team, communication. You want to pull all those things together, just keep pounding away, and you'll get to it piece by piece, day by day. Just keep trying at it, and you'll get there.
Perfect. Well, gents, thank you again for coming on the show, folks. If you wouldn't mind, subscribe to the channel wherever you're listening, share with a friend, help them on the